Thanks everyone for joining us back at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad to welcome back on the program Dr. Gerald Horne, who holds the Moores Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. His research has addressed issues of racism in a variety of relations involving labor, politics, civil rights, international relations, and war. Dr. Horne received his PhD in history from Columbia University, which we'll be discussing a bit today, and is the author of more than 30 books and 100 scholarly articles and reviews, including my personal favorite and the very paradigm-shifting book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States. Dr. Horne, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I want to go back because, as James Baldwin says, the past is not past. In the U.S., there's a history of students standing up or sitting down against injustice, sit-ins against segregation, protests against the Vietnam War, against apartheid, protest against the Iraq War. Occupy was also big at campuses. And in fact, in April 1968, hundreds of students at Columbia University were brutally arrested and injured after protesting weapons research for the Vietnam War that was ongoing. The university was shut down for a whole week. And now that same university, along with dozens across the country, is the center point of protests for free Palestine and against the genocide in Gaza. So I was wondering, Dr. Horne, if you could give us kind of a broad picture of the history of these kind of protests at college campuses and why you feel that they are these center points of protest.
Well, first of all, this question of youth and student protests is not just a U.S. issue. If you look around the world, you'll find that youth and students have been in the vanguard of protests, be it South Africa, South Korea, or wherever. And I think it has something to do with a kind of inbred idealism amongst the youth who have not lived long enough to be jaded, for example, and oftentimes are told in their classrooms about the heroism of preceding generations, and are told in their classrooms that the way change has arrived has been not least because of young people putting their bodies on the line. Returning to the United States of America, that's particularly been the case on these shores. You mentioned the anti-Jim Crow protests. We all know that if you go back some decades to the early 1960s and the protests in Birmingham, Alabama against Jim Crow, U.S. apartheid, these folks who were in the streets were not only students, some of them were as young as 9 years old. And in part because parents would be penalized, perhaps fired from their jobs if they joined Dr. King's protests. And so in many ways, that epical struggle in Birmingham, Alabama was a children's crusade. And that leads us, of course, to today, where one would have to be a cynic or an ignoramus to ignore how the US tax dollars are being expended in order to enforce what the International Court of Justice calls a plausible case for genocide with regard to Israeli depredations in Gaza. And so it's no surprise that protests are spreading like wildfire, not only from New York, but through Washington University in St. Louis, Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, University of Texas at Austin, UCLA, USC. And I think that we need to take our hats off to these students who have joined the question, so to speak. But at the same time, not only saluting the students, we should be in solidarity with the students, making sure that they have sufficient legal support and legal advocacy as they face the prospect of being penalized in courts. And we also should engage in a bit of self-criticism as well, because I'm not sure if older generations, my generation, for example, has prepared adequately these students for what they're encountering. To mention one point amongst many, justifiably and understandably, the students have raised the question of what they call settler colonialism in historic Palestine. But our generation has not done an adequate job of apprising students about settler colonialism in North America. And that opens up the students to charges of hypocrisy uh, launched by so-called Israeli patriots, for example. And likewise, our generation has helped to popularize terms like identity politics, for example, oftentimes used to describe Black protests, for example. And yet at the same time, I defy and dare anyone to find any person who has ever used the term identity politics to apply to Israel, which is a state based upon an exclusivist ethno-religious identity, where privileges and exemptions are handed out on the basis of that identity. And so we have not prepared our students, our youth, for what they're encountering. And we need to, of course, go back to the woodshed as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you were speaking, I was reminded of Assata Shakur's quote, "No one is going to give you the education you need to overthrow them," which seems very apt here in the US. And so I'm also curious with this historical look. I mean, we're coming up also on the anniversary, the 54th anniversary, I believe, of the Kent State shooting. And there have been, people have talked about whether National Guard would be called in. Riot cops have been called in already and have brutalized students across the country. We've seen images of this. They've even brutalized, not that it's any more or less okay, but they've brutalized professors as well who have been screaming that they're professors. So I'm curious if you could make that comparison with regards to the police state's response to protests then and now, and if you see it as a possibility or even a likelihood that we would see another Kent State type situation at one of these universities.
Well, I regret having to say that that is a distinct possibility. I need only point you to the recent inflamed remarks of Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas after pro-Palestinian protests erupted in the San Francisco Bay Area. He suggested, to put it euphemistically, that muscular tactics be employed against these protesters. Recall, this is the same Senator Cotton who, during the George Floyd protests of a few years back, wrote an op-ed controversially for the New York Times suggesting similar so-called muscular tactics, which of course led to the editor of the op-ed page having to be forced out of his office, not least because of protests by Black journalists in particular at the New York Times. And I might also say that as an alumnus of Columbia University, as you mentioned in your introduction, I've been following that case very carefully. And if I may say so, I think that President Shafiq of Columbia, shall we say, has been ill-served by her advisors. Obviously, she did not have that much contact with the United States of America before assuming this prestigious post in Morningside Heights. She is, of course, of Egyptian origin and had served with international financial institutions, had served in London. And I think that her advisors should have told her, or should have impressed upon her more pointedly, the fact that bringing police onto campuses, as Columbia 1968 shows, and other examples subsequently have demonstrated, is not the ideal way to deal with a peaceful protest, not least because we all know that there is a strain of so-called right-wing populism amongst police forces who have a particular animosity and antipathy to what they consider to be elitist universities, populated as they see it by elitist students. And so at times when they march into the campus, they seize the opportunity to wage and enforce a kind of rough justice from their point of view on these students. And so this was utterly predictable what have unfolded in the past few days. And I think that the authorities at the University of Southern California are learning the same bitter lesson. But alas, it all began in Morningside Heights, Columbia University.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to shift here to, again, some history since I have you here, and talk about something that I feel a lot of people, I wasn't taught this in school. A lot of people don't know about, specifically the Powell memo. Lewis Powell, who was a U.S. Supreme Court justice, wrote in 1971, before his appointment to the Supreme Court, what's known as the Powell Memo, a memorandum to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce with suggestions on how to protect the American free enterprise system from its enemies, i.e., communists, socialists, and, as he says, other leftists. He notes that this movement against the system often originates from college campuses and calls it the most, quote, dynamic source of the assault on American enterprise, and decries speakers and teachings at these campuses that criticize American capitalism and, quote, the values of Western society. He writes about the need to stack the faculty with conservative professors to outweigh liberal and leftist viewpoints. He calls on the Chamber of Commerce to be an organized battering ram against this wave of dissent, suggesting a staff of scholars who, quote, believe in the system, to be put forward for posts, a staff of speakers to speak for the chamber at universities, the evaluation of textbooks to make sure that pro-business perspectives are included, and other ways of dominating campus life. Dr. Horne, I'm curious, how would you rate the efficacy of this memo? And do you see what's happening now as a shift away from what Powell had hoped and planned for?
Well, it seems if Justice Powell, to use his subsequent title, had the gift of prophecy, because what he outlined some decades ago, we see being implemented from coast to coast as we speak. You may know, according to an article in the current issue of the American Historical Review, the leading journal for the historical profession in the United States of America, that there's a war on Black history, for example. Nicole Hannah Jones' 1619 Project, first a New York Times Magazine special about 5 years ago, and now a best-selling book, fundamentally has been banned in Florida and in Texas, according to this article. You have librarians that are being threatened. You have high school principals and teachers who are being threatened. At Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, now supposedly there's going to be allegedly a way to monitor professors to make sure they're presenting all points of view in the classroom. So I guess that means that you just can't be anti-slavery. You have to bring the pro-slavery point of view into the classroom. You just can't be anti-Nazi. You have to bring the pro-Nazi point of view in the classroom. And likewise, you have these universities, many of whom are dependent upon the favors of billionaires that are being pressured. Likewise, Robert Kraft, who also happens to own the New England Patriots football team, of course, is a resident of Massachusetts, has been suggesting that in light of events at Columbia, he's turning off the tap in terms of his donations to his alma mater. You see that Bill Ackman of Pershing Capital, another card-carrying member of the 1%, is boasting about how he led the charge to force out of office Claudine Gay, the first Black woman president of Harvard University, forced out a few months ago. We see that at the University of Florida in Gainesville, a former US Senator, Ben Sasse of Nebraska, has taken the helm as president. And now we see erected at that campus in Gainesville an entire college devoted to so-called free enterprise principles, although it's going to be very interesting to see if they're going to be held to the same standards as other faculty in terms of publishing, for example, or if they're just going to hand plumb faculty posts to propagandists. This is a clear and present danger. With regard to the Israeli question, you're probably familiar with these various so-called blacklists that are circulating on the internet. I don't know if I should say I'm part of one, singling out faculty because of their pro-Palestinian positions. Who knows how that's going to be used going forward. And so what Justice Powell suggested has gone beyond his initial statements. We're facing a real rollback of academic freedom. In the current issue of the New Yorker, there is an article by the Harvard professor, Louis Menand, who says as much and suggests that many will come to rue the day that academic freedom was rolled back. Because on the one hand, you have seen that the United States of America has tried to preen and posture on the international stage as being a paragon of civil liberties virtue, stressing the efficacy of free speech, the right to petition, the right to protest, etc. But now we see that some of these pledges and promises have been empty in many ways, because when the rubber hits the road, when people begin to exercise their right to protest, you see that jackbooted police officers come on campus and drag faculty members off by the nape of their neck, as happened to a professor of philosophy at Emory University, not to mention countless students from the Atlantic to the Pacific.
Yeah, absolutely. And with regards to you mentioning the income aspect, the Associated Press reported recently that according to the Education Department database, about 100 U.S. colleges have reported gifts or contracts from Israel totaling $375 million over the past 2 decades. The data tells us little about where the money comes from or how it's used, and the Associated Press, which, by the way, is not like some pro-Palestine brag, also points out that underreporting is rife. So this is just the reporting that we're aware of. And so, Dr. Horne, I'm curious, with your experience in universities and colleges, I mean, what do you think is going to happen here? Because these universities are literally getting bankrolled by Israel and Israeli interests. So what do you see happening? I mean, it doesn't seem like the students are backing down, which is really powerful to see, but it doesn't seem like the universities feel that they can, because, oh, there goes the purse strings. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the United States is in a classic dilemma with regard to students not backing down. Once again, Columbia students have set the pace. Recall that shortly after President Shafiq's escapade on Capitol Hill, where she threw faculty members overboard, tossed them to the incoming Republican wolves in order to try to save what she thought to be the tattered reputation of her university, Columbia. She went back to campus and was greeted by a hellstorm of critique from faculty who are now in the process of investigating her. Apparently, she released confidential details in Washington about investigations of faculty that she was not authorized to release. When she brought cops onto campus, students did not fold. Instead, they escalated. They enhanced and increased the nature and level of the encampment. And likewise, with regard to the suspensions that are being implemented of students as we speak, the students once again have escalated. They have seized a building, Hamilton Hall, which has been the site of numerous protests at Columbia University, not only in 1968, but in the mid 1980s with regard to anti-apartheid protests. So there's a glorious tradition there. I'm not sure what's going to happen, because I think that the billionaires who are pro-Israel feel that there is wind in their sails. You might have seen the article in the New York Times by Andrew Sorkin, who, as you know, also has a side hustle on CNBC, where he suggested that the corporate sector monitor and fly-spec carefully applicants for these prized positions and basically refuse to hire students who have been implicated in these protests. So once again, you see this contradiction. On the one hand, the United States likes to boast and brag about how it comes out of this so-called revolutionary tradition, which leads inevitably and inexorably to the First Amendment and the right to protest, et cetera, supporting democratic upsurges abroad, be they in Myanmar, Burma, or elsewhere. But when it comes to this country, when people decide to take that rhetoric seriously, you see that there's a crackdown. So, speaking objectively, I have to say I'm not very optimistic about what's going to happen on campuses going forward. Uh, I don't want to throw cold water on the students' protests because, as I said, I think that they merit and deserve our unstinting support. But it doesn't seem like the other side feels depressed, or it doesn't seem like the other side is in any way in retreat. And so, what that means is that we're going to have to emulate the students at Columbia, which is to escalate until they retreat.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to circle back because you mentioned the apartheid protests in the 80s. And of course, right now, these protests are targeting the apartheid state of Israel. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how you feel how those student protests in the 80s had an effect on ending apartheid in South Africa and how that might be emulated today with regards to the effect of these protests on the apartheid state of Israel.
It is difficult to either overestimate or underestimate the profundity of these protests on campuses during the 1980s. Not only on campuses, but you might recall that at the South African embassy in Washington, D.C., beginning shortly after the November 1984 elections, there erupted the so-called Free South Africa movement, where it became a kind of badge of honor for celebrity protesters to be handcuffed and dragged away from protesting apartheid. Recall that these protests not only had impact with regard to universities anticipating the demand of today, that is to say, divesting from corporations that have had holdings in apartheid South Africa, but you also saw that it had a catalytic impact on anti-apartheid legislation that passed over the veto of US President Ronald Wilson Reagan, who, by the way, was trying to throw sand in the eyes of the US public by arguing that South Africa had been a long-term ally, speaking of apartheid South Africa, when in fact we know that in the 1930s and the 1940s, the apartheid and pre-apartheid rulers were figuratively in bed with Nazi Germany, for example. And so these students, by adopting this tactic of a divestment, on the one hand, they localized a global issue, but at the same time, they helped to contribute to a national movement with regard to legislation in Washington. And it's still remarkable to note that even though the so-called European allies are oftentimes to the left of the United States, or even Canada for that matter, with its single-payer healthcare system, the United States in many ways was to the left of the so-called allies with regard to anti-apartheid legislation. That is to say, the United States was a pioneer in that regard, which is quite unusual. And I don't think that we can understand that without understanding the energy of these student protesters, not least at Columbia University, and the energy of the anti-apartheid movement. Now, obviously, the situation with regard to Israel is a tad different. If you look at the central constituency with regard to the anti-apartheid movement, although there may have been naysayers here and there, the Black community was generally speaking united in one voice against apartheid South Africa. And that paid dividends with regard to divestment, with regard to sanctions legislation. I don't think I'm talking out of school to suggest that the central constituency with regard to Israel, speaking of the Jewish community, is split. That is to say, honorably and justifiably, there's Jewish Voices for Peace, there's If Not Now. There are many heroic protesters with regard to Israeli genocide in Gaza that emerged from the Jewish community. But it's no secret, as my preceding remarks suggested, that you have a number of pro-Zionist billionaires, not only Robert Kraft of Massachusetts and Bill Ackman, but the Adelson family of Nevada, who have enormous gambling interests of funding both the Republican Party and funding the Likud party and Mr. Netanyahu more specifically. And so this fissure, this split in the central constituency, speaking of the Jewish community, helps to distinguish it from what happened in the 1980s. And we're going to have to put our heads together and figure out what that's going to mean going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of wrapping up here, I'm also curious because as far as I understand, what we didn't see during the apartheid protests back in the 80s was I mean, you mentioned the Adelson family, and Adelson actually had this meeting with Netanyahu where they created this project to basically surveil, in particular, students to try and root out this anti-Israel, this anti-apartheid organizing. And there's been, I mean, we've read about it in several different news outlets about how there's so much surveillance of these kind of activities in order to root it out, in order to call it anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm curious if there's any kind of comparison there. Was there like a blacklist back then of people who were anti-apartheid in South Africa? Like, was there any kind of machine like that was also working against students in that way?
Well, I'm afraid to say that there was a similar machinery. In fact, if you look at my book on the anti-apartheid movement, the coming to independence of South Africa in 1994, you'll find that your guest himself was being surveilled. That is to say, and here's where the confluence comes, that the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith was monitoring people like myself and had an association with certain, I'll say charitably and euphemistically, rogue police officers in the San Francisco Police Department, although they might not have been rogue at all, who were monitoring those of us in the movement. I recall, for example, that when Chris Hani, a leader of Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, came to Los Angeles, I hosted him. There were intelligence reports filed with regard to his remarks, with regard to my being the MC of his appearance. And then shortly thereafter, Chris Hani was assassinated in South Africa as he was out for a morning jog. And I've often wondered if there was any sort of correlation between those two events, whether or not his, I'm afraid to say, rather poor security was noted in Los Angeles, and whether or not that was transmitted to the apartheid authorities in South Africa, who acted accordingly. However, having said that, I think that what's happening with regard to protests today dwarfs and the monitoring and surveillance of what was taking place in the 1980s. And I think it has a lot to do, once again, with the fact that you have a number of billionaires in particular who were rather open and notorious in support of Israeli apartheid. Oftentimes in the 1980s, many who were profiting from cheap Black labor in South Africa were using different sorts of rationales to justify that. For example, that sanctions would hurt the Black majority ultimately, and they were not necessarily coming out in a full-throated endorsement of apartheid. And so what that means is that in some ways, we face a rougher uphill climb today than we did in the 1980s. But given the role model that we're all seeking to emulate, speaking of the students at Columbia, the students at UCLA and USC, and in between, I'm confident to report that, like in the 1980s, I'm sure will prevail in the 2020s.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Horne. And I was wondering if you have any final thoughts or even suggestions for students who might be listening to this and are out protesting, or as you pointed out, folks like myself who are no longer students at universities, but rather students of life that are looking to work in solidarity with these students.
Well, one hopeful sign that's erupting as we speak is a renaissance, if you like, in the union movement. I'm looking specifically at the United Auto Workers under President Shawn Fain, which has had enormous and significant victories in Tennessee, the heart of darkness, that is to say, Dixie, when it comes to civil rights and civil liberties. That bodes well. And I would suggest that the students find a connection with the United Auto Workers, which shouldn't be that difficult, for example, because at places like Columbia, a good deal of the staff, believe it or not, are UAW members because the UAW has organized beyond auto plants, for example. And those of us who are students of history recognize that if you look at the anti-Jim Crow movement in the 1950s and 1960s, the silent partner was the United Auto Workers under then leader Walter Reuther. That helps to explain why Martin Luther King and his comrades could fly all over the country with and participate like historic example or historic analogy to a kind of Johnny Appleseed, for example. And it's not just the United Auto Workers and other unions, but also celebrities, entertainers like the late Harry Belafonte. So I would suggest that the students try to find a connection with local unions. That should not be difficult in a place like Los Angeles, for example, where the LA County Federation of Labor has come out like the UAW in favor of a ceasefire. I think that they will be predisposed to listen to the inquiries and requests of student protesters. And likewise, I would suggest that the students hook up with the National Lawyers Guild, in existence since 1937, a left-leaning organization of lawyers and legal workers. Full disclosure, I used to work closely with the National Lawyers Guild. They were very helpful to anti-apartheid protesters who were getting detained and arrested in the 1980s. So that would be my recommendation to students. But if recent history is any guide, I'm sure that they beat me to the punch by already anticipating those sorts of suggestions.
Well, we hope so. It seems that they have a good handle on the present, and therefore we hope that they have a pretty good handle on history as well. Dr. Horne, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.